So even though I own tens of thousands of dollars of camera gear right behind me, the only camera setup that I have been shooting professionally for the past month has been this $500 setup that I got right here. And this is a camera build that I bought specifically for doing both fashion and portrait shoots, so I'm not gonna say that this is the best camera for every situation, but for my professional needs, this camera has been pretty much perfect for most of my shoots. And since it is such a cheap setup to buy, only $500, you get a full frame 24 megapixel Sony camera, and you get a 50mm 1.8 lens with it. I figured this camera setup would also be a perfect entry level setup for someone who wants to make money taking pictures of people. So let's get into it right now. So one of the main reasons why I chose this camera setup is because, first of all, I'm a Sony shooter. My main camera is the Sony a7R III that I got right here, and I absolutely love this camera. And I have a bunch of lenses that, I can shoot with, right over here. As you can see, most of these lenses are Sony lenses. There's a couple of Canon EF lenses and like a couple of Micro Four Thirds lenses that I have also, but most of my pretty much all my professional lenses are Sony, so that's number reason why I got it. So if you're someone who wants to get into, shooting with Sony cameras and Sony lenses, the A7 is still such an amazing choice, because this A7 camera, even though it is older, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of the newer cameras, especially with the 3 series of cameras, the A7 III and the A7R III, they added a bunch of new features that the A7 II or the one didn't have. But the important thing that this camera still has is the 24 megapixel sensor on this camera. First of all, it's full frame, so you are going to get some amazing bokeh with this camera. It still has the phase detect autofocus with it, so you're going to have amazing autofocus. Not as good as the newer cameras, but it's still great in my opinion. And the image quality that comes out of this camera is still as good as Sony's newer cameras, like the A7 camera. There's also a 24 megapixel sensor as this one. I'm sure the sensor on that is like slightly better. It'll probably have like a little bit better dynamic range or whatever. But when it comes to photography, honestly, this camera is still gonna take world-class pictures with it, and it only costs $350. Now let's talk about what I do, because I'm not one of these, YouTubers that you watch comparison videos with, see, how well this camera stacks up to this camera, and like they'll just take pictures of their dogs or their wife or whatever. I don't do that. I'm actually using this camera gear, and what I do is that I'm a fashion photographer in New York City, so I'm constantly traveling around in New York City, going to different studios, meeting up with 5 to 6 models a day, taking thousands of pictures a week. So I need a camera that I can, wear and tear, that I'm gonna be, pretty much destroying, after a couple of years. That's why I want to have a cheap setup, because I can use my expensive gear. Like, let me grab it real quick. Like, I can use my Sony a7R III with my 28-75 2.8 lens, which in my opinion is probably the best setup if you're just trying to, take pictures of people where, you're posing people, or you're doing even headshots. You can just zoom 75mm, take some headshots with it, and then go back to, 35 and 50mm range, and then you can take some full body shots of people. But honestly, just taking thousands of pictures a week, just puts a lot of wear and tear on your camera. You're gonna be putting a lot of shutters into your camera, and you can even see it on my Tamron Pro lens right here. Here, if this thing ever focus on it. What are you doing? Oh my god. I'm sorry, Tony Northup. You're disappointing me. I can't focus on it. Here, I'm gonna go to manual focus. Manual focuses. We're doing this together. I'm not cutting it. Right here, as you can see, the plastic on the zoom lens, started coming off. Here, let's go back to autofocus. So honestly, just shooting every day puts a lot of wear and tear in your camera. So I only really use these cameras more for specific shoots that I have. Like if I'm shooting a magazine cover, if I'm shooting a billboard, or if I'm working on album cover, if I'm doing something that's going to pay me a lot more money, then I'll use my pro gear on it. But honestly, if I don't need to use something like this, if I can just get good enough results by using cheaper gear, then I'm gonna do that. Because, for example, if you want to drive across the country just to have fun, you're not gonna drive your Ferrari to do that. You're gonna use your Honda Civic or something. It's a car that you're gonna be able to, put wear and tear into. So let's talk about my setup that I got right here on this Lower Pro bag. I'm not sponsored by them, but this is a bag I absolutely love because of how small and light it is. And first, let's start out with the Fiji bottle, because I don't have this because I'm a snob, because I love Fiji bottles because they actually make high quality bottles that you can reuse over and over again without them smelling like shit. So that's a cool little thing. But let's open this Lower Pro bag up. I'm going to show you guys my setup, and it's very simple. Like, I keep it very simple, like right here. This is all I bring with me. Just my Sony A7 camera. We got a 24 megapixel full frame, amazing quality, and we got our 50mm 1.8 lens, which is a very cheap lens that you can get for, I believe you can get it for $200 new, or you can buy it used on eBay, and which is what I tried doing. I almost bought it for $118, but like literally the last second someone outbid me by like $1 and they got it instead. And then I got pissed off and I just drove to Best Buy and just bought this lens new. But honestly, it's an amazing lens that you get pretty decent sharpness with. At 1.8, it's a little soft, so if you have a lot of sunlight, I recommend you shoot at 2.8. At 2.8, you get decent sharpness. But then when you're like shooting with it in studio, where you're shooting with f8 or whatever, then this lens is like sharp as pretty much any other lens. So once you go past like 5.6, like this lens is very sharp. And as you can see, I got a battery grip on this camera because first of all, this camera has the older Sony batteries on there. I forget what they're called, but it doesn't have the same batteries as like the A7 III camera, so it's smaller batteries. So having a battery grip on the camera makes so that it lasts, double the time, and also it just feels way better in the hands because these Sony cameras are just way too small in my opinion, which is honestly is fine because again you can just add a battery grip to it so actually it fits your hands. But if you don't have a battery grip, like look at how small this is. This is just like your pinky is falling off. It just feels like a toy in the hand, and honestly like for like just clientele work, it's always better to have a bigger camera. If someone's paying you like $10,000 for a photo shoot, you don't want to show up there with like a tiny little camera and be like, I'm ready to take a picture, sir. You want them to feel, you want your clients to feel like, if they paid you a lot of money to, do a photo shoot, that they're getting their money worth. So, I mean, there's a lot of psychological aspects to photography that I'm not going to get into in this video, but just having a bigger camera does make people feel more confident in you. And also, if you just have a model in front of you that you're shooting with, if you just have a bigger camera, they'll listen to you better. I mean, there's a lot of psychological things, but you don't have to use it if you don't want to. But personally, I love battery grips. And then next we got my SD card holder right here. Just a simple SD card holder. I think I bought it for like $10 or something from Amazon. That way I can just keep my SD cards in here nice and secure just in case if something happens to my bag. Then I got my battery chargers right here. Very simple. Then I got my Godox trigger for triggering the studio lights. And that's it. That's pretty much all I bring with me. I do have some like lens cleaning stuff also. But besides that, this is literally all I bring with me. Because I do travel a lot. I'm usually traveling around an hour and a half just to get to New York City. And then walk around there for like another 10-15 minutes to get to different studios. So personally, I just wanted to have a light setup that I can go around with. Now again, this camera isn't perfect for every situation. It's just perfect for what I do. For shooting fashion and doing portrait photography, this camera does work perfectly fine for me. But again, depends on what you do. There are some limitations with this camera. First of all, this is a limitation that I didn't even think about. Like, I just thought it would have it. But that this camera does not have sound shooting. So even though this is a mirrorless camera, there's no way to shoot silently with this camera, which is pretty shitty in my opinion, because if you want to do something like, any event or wedding photography, and personally, I do a lot of behind the scenes for movies and TV, and when I'm shooting behind the scenes for movie or TV, I like to take pictures while they're rolling, so I can't do that with this camera, because if I try to, you're gonna get a bunch of, clicking, So with the A7R III, I can shoot silently, but with this camera, you can't do that. Another problem with this camera is that it only has a one SD card slots, which means if you wanted to shoot any weddings, then you can't really do that with this camera. I mean, you can, but if you want to work for any wedding companies or if you want a second shoot for someone, most people require you to have a camera that has 2 SD card slots. So with this camera, you won't be able to do that. But pretty much any other job doesn't really require you to have 2 SD card slots. So that can be a bad thing depending on what kind of a shooter you are. But personally, since I do mainly studio photography, I just have a client come in, I take pictures of them, and then I give my SD card to my retoucher, and then they back up the photos and edit all the photos. So personally, I don't have to worry about having 2 SD card slots. Now, the thing about this camera is it's not the best video camera because first of all, this camera can only shoot 1080p, which is, if you watch my channel, you know that I prefer 1080p over 4K, but this camera can only shoot 1080p. It does shoot in a lower bitrate than the newer cameras, and this camera has no like picture profiles. There's no like S-Log or anything. You're just going to be shooting in the default picture profiles, so you can't really do that much grading. But you know what, how about we do like a little vlogging test? So we'll take this 50mm lens off and we'll replace it with this lens right here, the Tamron 17-28, and we'll see how the footage compares, to what I'm shooting with right now, which is the Sony FS5 cinema camera, and we'll compare it to this Sony A7 camera. Alright, now we're shooting with the Sony A7 camera with the Tamron 17-28mm, which is what I was using before on the Sony FS5. So let's see how it compares to that one. And from what I see, the image quality looks pretty similar to it. Obviously, we're shooting with like the default picture profile thing. Like on the Sony FS5, I was shooting with S-Log 3 on like 1080p 10 bits, so we don't have that in this camera. But honestly, for most situations, I think something like this is fine. And we are using the Sony shotgun mic thing that I have on top of the camera right here, so we'll see how that sounds. Right here I'm like stepping out of the light, so we're just using auto ISO, and I don't know how that looks really. From what I can tell, looks pretty dark. Yeah, it looks pretty dark from the mirror, from just like looking at it over here. But from what I can tell, the camera is doing a decent job at keeping my face in focus, right? I think it's doing a good job. But anyways, this is an extra lens that you would have to buy. So now let's put a lavalier mic on the Sony A7. I'm gonna use the Rode Mic Go, which is like the cheapest one you can buy. I think this is around $200. And we're gonna set this camera on a tripod and put the 50mm 1.8 on it and see how that looks if you were to ever to record like a interview or just do like a corporate video or something, something to make you money. We'll see how that looks right now. Okay, now we're shooting with the Sony A7 with the 50mm 1.8, and for audio we're using the Rode Mic Go microphone and the receiver on there, and this is a pretty inexpensive setup. I believe the Rode Mic Go is around $200, so for a setup like this, it's extremely cheap. And the light I'm using is actually a $150 LED panel. If you guys are interested in that, I can make a separate video on that. But for this video, I want to mainly focus on the camera right here. So from what I've seen, the video quality looks amazing. It looks pretty much similar to what you would get out of the Sony A7 III camera. So right there is pretty incredible. The only problem with the 1080p is that it can only go up to 60 frames per second. So if you want to do slow motion, you can do some slow motion with 60 frames. When you bring 60 frames to 24 frames per second, you can slow it down to I believe 40%. So you do get it's a little bit of a slow motion going. It's not like the A7 camera where you can go up to 120 frames per second. And I believe with the A7S III cameras, you can go up to like 240 frames per second now on those. But again, this camera is still quite amazing, and honestly, for the value you're getting for only what, $500, it is quite amazing. You don't get the picture profiles to get the maximum amount of dynamic range, but again, if you're shooting something similar to this, if you're shooting a scenario where you're doing a talking heads video or like an interview or something, you don't need that much dynamic range, especially if you're shooting someone in like an office building or whatever. You don't need 15 stops of dynamic range. That only really helps if you're like shooting in like natural light where you have like a dark subject and like a bright sky or whatever. It does help, to have a big dynamic range in the skin tones, but if you light it in a certain way, like how I'm lighting it right now, you can actually get away with having a limited amount of dynamic range as long as you are using all of that limited dynamic range that you do have. So personally, I think this camera is quite amazing, and you know what, let's take the camera outside and shoot a little bit outside in natural light also to see how that holds up, and we'll talk more about the amount of value you get from this camera. Alright, so actually I just reviewed that footage and honestly it was kind of shitty, to be honest. It kept losing my face with the autofocus, but that could have been because of the 50mm 1.8 lens. That lens is not the best autofocusing lens, but on my A7R III the autofocus actually works quite well. So the combination of this camera's older autofocus system and the lens also being not the best autofocusing lens, it was not a good combo. But now we're using the Tamron 17 to 28mm, so it should in theory be better, but we'll see how it is once I'm done, recording it. But honestly guys, this camera is still pretty amazing to this day in my opinion. For video work, I wouldn't really recommend it. The image quality isn't really there. If it's your only camera, you can get away with it, especially since you're gonna have access to so many great lenses on the Sony E mount. It's just gonna allow you to, like even with the 50mm 1.8, besides like the actual image quality itself, the bokeh and like if you manual focus that lens, it would actually be a really good looking image. It's just that, there's a lot of compression with the video, and it's just a very low bit rate video resolution compared to what you would get out of like the Sony a7 III or the FS5 that I was shooting with the earlier parts of the video. But in my opinion, this camera is still a great buy to this day. I bought mine for $350 used at bnh.com. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but if you can get a good deal on it and you're trying to get into photography and you want a full frame camera, in my opinion, this is the way to go. A lot of people recommend you to get the A7 II, and that's around $1,000. If you can afford it, obviously get the A7 II. But if you can't, I think this camera is still an amazing option, especially if you're just going to do photography. For that, it's a no-brainer. The 24 megapixels out of this camera is going to be the same image quality as you would get out of the a7 III pretty much. So anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, make sure to leave a comment in the comment section below, or if you have any questions about the camera or the lens, please let me know and I'll try to respond to it best as I can. I make videos every single week, so make sure to subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.